that I took with me to Vassar and Columbia University for 2 years until my father went bankrupt. But I still held on to my social consciousness and valued justice, freedom, love, human potential, and possibilities in relationships. That was the time of the Depression that I became a political advocate. I was involved in proletarian literature, and as artists, we were committed to social justice and change. We were criticized for being too involved in this movement, and we were criticized for not being involved enough. I was attacked on my poetry, but I still was involved with the Scottsboro case, the Spanish Civil War. I went to Spain and worked against fascism. I fought against the Vietnam War. I investigated the Silicos cases in West Virginia and attended the American Writers' Conference, which is sponsored by the Communist Party, though I didn't become a communist. But the FBI had me on file for 40 years. Even in the 50s and 60s, when I taught at Sarah Lawrence College, I was investigated and called dangerous, subversive. And even my parents disowned me. I raised a son as a single mom on my own in those times, and that was an important part of my life. So I want to talk about the struggles that I lived through in these years of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s of the last century. I quote Henry James as saying, "It is a difficult fate to be an American." And I want to read 2 poems now that talk about the consciousness that I wanted to evoke in people that listen to my poetry. This poem is called simply Poem. I lived in the first century of world wars. Most mornings I would be more or less insane. The newspapers would arrive with their careless stories. The news would pour out of various devices, interrupted by attempts to sell products to the unseen. I would call my friends on other devices. They would be more or less mad for similar reasons. Slowly, I would get to pen and paper, make my poems for others unseen and unborn. In the day, I would be reminded of those men and women, brave, setting up signals across vast distances, considering a nameless way of living, of almost unimagined values. As the lights darkened and the lights of night brightened, we would try to imagine them, try to find each other, to construct peace, to make love, to reconcile waking with sleeping, ourselves with each other, ourselves with ourselves. We would try by any means to reach the limits of ourselves, to reach beyond ourselves, to let go the means, to wake. I lived in the first century of these wars. The other thing that I had to reconcile in these years, in the 60s and 70s, was to reconcile being Jewish and a number of years, we didn't talk about those things. And then finally, we had to acknowledge ourselves. To be Jew in the 20th century. To be a Jew in the 20th century is to be offered a gift. If you refuse wishing to be invisible, you choose death of the spirit, the stone insanity. Accepting, take full life, full agonies. Your evening deep in labyrinthine blood of those who resist, fail and resist, and God reduced to a hostage among hostages. The gift is torment, not alone the still torture, isolation, or torture of the flesh, that may come also, but the accepting wish, the whole and fertile spirit as guarantee for every human freedom, suffering to be free, daring to live for the impossible. I will come back in a few moments.
Thank you, Muriel. All dead poets, would you please join the rest of us, the mostly living, for refreshments in the back, and maybe give some more poetry after the break? Yes? Thank you so much. Can we all give some kind of audible acknowledgement to the volunteers and coordinators of the Silverton Poetry Association? Thank you. You helped me to express myself. Doesn't everybody feel really good about how we ushered in the dead poets who are alive tonight? There's another sort of advanced technique for bringing in dead poets, and it's a slow stomping sound. If you can practice this, kind of act like a ghost. You know, people. Dead people like this sound. Yeah. Okay. Now, if you can just, yeah. No. How do I know? Oh, I was asked, how do I know this? It's from the Ghostbusters app.
On your iPhone.
On my iPhone, it does. Yeah. I meant it for those of you who aren't here. Your cell phone does not need to be on for this app to work. Okay. Thank you for laughing at my joke twice. We're going to attempt to evoke a dead poets, and this time I would like an intention. This is such a wonderful house. Maybe somebody who's had a history with this house. What do you think? All right. Eyes half closed, please. Ooh, and extra. Yeah. Ooh. 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 Maybe some poetry. It's Bert. It's Bert Gear. Bert Gear grew up in this house, and he'll tell us whether or not he died here. How are you, Bert?
Well, thank you for having me back, William. It's been a long time.
What a pleasure.
Good evening. You know, my father was 1 year old when his parents came across the Oregon Trail. And they came over the Barlow Pass in the fall of 1847. And they came down the valley, and my grandmother had a cousin who had come the year before, and they lived up east of here in a little cabin. So that's where they went first off. And Ralph, he got on his horse and he started riding around looking for a place to make a claim. He came down here about where we're standing. He looked down the bottom of the hill, and there was a little log house down there. Now, he rode down there, and a fellow by the name of William Parker had come a year before and made a claim on this square mile. But there was word going around the valley at that time that a ship had pulled in from San Francisco into Portland, and they was buying up every pick and shovel they could find. And there was something going on in California, a big gold strike, and they all knew about it. And Parker got gold fever. And he decided that's where he had to go, so he sold his rights to this piece of ground right here. And Ralph and Mary brought their 4 kids down here, and they lived in that cabin. Ralph, he was a nurseryman, and he planted out his seeds. He grew up apple and pear trees. And because of the boom in the economy from the gold strike, he did good. 4 years later, he built this house. This house was built in 1851. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. It's the oldest frame-built residence in Oregon that stayed in the same family. Now, I was the 3rd generation of that family. And I wasn't actually born here. I was born up in the Palouse because my papa, who was 1 year old, 47, he run sheep up there. So most of us kids were born up there in that area. But we come back and we lived down here for a few years when I was growing up. And I went off with my cousin back to New York, and I worked on a newspaper back there. My cousin's name was Homer Davenport, and he is a cartoonist for William Randolph Hearst. And he got me and my sister Musa, he got us jobs on the newspapers back there, and we was back there for a while. And that lasted a while, and then we come back, and I was run a ferry up on the Columbia River, and I was sheriff over in Lincoln County for a while. Finally, I ended up retired up in Goldendale area up there. 1960, I died. So it's been a while since I've been walking around here. But back in 1907, 6 and 7, there was a movement on to take down Castle Rock and use it for road beds, blow it up. They had a train car load of dynamite there ready to take it down, and a number of us folks living around here thought that wasn't right, so we started a movement, and we were able to stop them. And I wanted to read you a little poem I wrote, and it was published in the Portland paper, and it goes like this. A plea for Castle Rock. Standing there resisting age and time, uplifting, huge, majestic, and sublime, unmoved through those scarred by warring elements, still shouldering up its towering battlements, it stands, a crown, a wreath of vernal wood, the castle monolith has always stood. Mirrored where the river comes to greet, bending in obeisance at its feet, it casts in shadow down into the stream, the idol of its wavering, unborn dream, and rears above the forest's dismal roar, a guard that's keeping vigil evermore. The craft of earth, the wiles of nature's wild, have left it standing firm and unbeguiled. The river's never-ending rush of tides have beat in vain on those unflinching sides. The forest trees have gored their horns to dust, but still the rock defied each plunge and thrust. Within its shadow, heaps of human bones have bleached and crumbled, and the stones about its base on which the heaps once lay have given up to frost and to decay. It stands eternal in its rugged height, symbolic of unconquerable might. Upon its brow the trees have hung a crown, from which a liquid crystal sparkles down. The wind and river croon and bathe its feet. Its sun-kissed flowers yield a fragrance sweet, a victor over forest, frost and flood. It stands as boldly as it always stood. The first explorers found beneath its dome a shelter from the storm, a heaven home. It served them as a tower from which they spied the waiting paradise, a land untried. Unnumbered hordes have worshipped at its base, in multitudes, in race succeeding race. Should hand of man play havoc and defile the grace and grandeur of that castle pile? Should ease of access or rock worth employ to wreck the ancient landmark and destroy? If saying nay would leave it standing so, oh, would its million tongues might thunder no. You know, I had occasion to come back down here from time to time from up in Goldendale, Washington, and back in the 1940s and 50s, my brother had owned the house, my little brother Archie, and he'd moved on into Salem, and the house sat here vacant for a lot of years, and it went downhill. And I think there's a drawing of it around here somewhere showing what it looked like, but the porches had fallen off, and the roof was leaking, the windows were mostly broken out of the house, and doors busted off, and cattle was living in the house at the time. And I came down one time, and I brought back old memories for me, and I wrote a little poem about the place as I saw it then. It said, "Old house, you seem to dream of days gone by. Your drooping mane reflects a veneration for those you hovered o'er. You saw them die. You seem to mourn a sleeping generation. Deserted now, your emptiness maintains its watch upon a landscape dark and still. But steadfast your companionship remains with yonder window and that wooded hill. If your dumb doors could tell the things they know, if your splintered threshold could but speak, there'd be a love tale in each murmured low, a sad tale in each window's creak. Your blackened rafters lurk with ghostly gloom, where mirth re-echoed to your loud encore. But still the sunshine seeks a barren room and plays its gambol on your dusty floor. The moon reaps reveries from your quiet sleep. The stars set heaven's watchlights faithfully. Well proud your chimneys nightly vigils keep as sentinels to guard your majesty. Do those gaunt spirits come and visit you? Was that reality, that shadows glide? Do those old comrades wander home at night to reveal at your ancient fireside? What stories of hard days the listener hears, what tales of untold dangers they withstood. No boasts were counted with the pioneers, their name's another word for hardihood. Old house, you seem to dream of days gone by. We join you in your quiet veneration. For those you hovered o'er, you saw them die, and how we miss that sleeping generation.
Thank you so much, Bert. And I see our poets not so dead have remained with us. Waldo, another session, we'd be honored.
Happy to say more. It's very pleasant to be in this house, which somewhat reminds me of my house in Concord. not just for the architecture, but for the great number of people who seem to be present and active here. After my Ellen died and I left the church, I sailed for Europe and traveled for several months. I toured the Roman ruins in Sicily, traveled north through Italy, and visited France, England, and Scotland. In Paris, I was greatly moved by the classification of plants in the Jardin des Plantes. There I experienced a moment of visionary insight into the interconnectedness of all things that Goethe had spoken of, and I determined to become a naturalist. I met with John Stuart Mill, William Wordsworth, the great Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Thomas Carlyle, who became my friends. Returning to Massachusetts, I moved with my mother to a family house in Concord, close to the streams and woodlands where I found my inspiration. I then saw the possibility of earning my livelihood as a lecturer. I spoke at first on the subject of natural history, but broadened my compass as time went on, not confined within the limits of any institution or tradition. A few fragments. I can only do my work well by abjuring the opinions and customs of all others and adhering strictly to the divine plan, a few dim inches of whose outline I faintly discern in my breast. All our progress is an unfolding, like a vegetable bud. You have first an instinct, then an opinion, then a knowledge. As the plant has root, bud, and fruit, trust the instinct to the end, though you can render no reason. My most famous essay is on self-reliance, but unfortunately it has been somewhat misunderstood. Self-reliance is not a faith in a man's own whim and conceit, as if he were quite severed from all other beings and acted on his own private account, but a perception that the mind common to the universe is disclosed to the individual through his own nature. Make the most of yourself, for that is all there is of you. As the wandering seabird, which crossing the ocean lights on some rock or islet to rest for a moment its wings and to look back on the wilderness of waves behind and onward to the wilderness of waters before, so stand we perched on this rock or shoal of time, arrived out of the immensity of the past and bound and road ready to plunge into immensity again. Be not the slave of your own past. Plunge into the sublime seas, dive deep and swim far, so you shall come back with self-respect, with new power, with an advanced experience that shall explain and overlook the old. Success depends on the aim, not on the means. Look at the mark, not at the arrow. I married again to Lydian Jackson of Plymouth, a good and intelligent woman, and bought my own house in Concord and filled it with the most interesting people of my time. Margaret Fuller and Henry Thoreau sometimes lived with us. In 1836, a group of us began meeting regularly to discuss ideas, and we became known as the Transcendental Club. Our critique of modern society centered on the willing purchase of material well-being at the expense of spiritual and humane values. Margaret edited our magazine, The Dial, for 2 years before turning it over to me for 2 more, an exhausting but rewarding experience. I had a great enthusiasm for experience and ideas. Nothing great was ever achieved without enthusiasm. My brother William became a lawyer in New York and later a judge, but my other brothers were not allowed such long and happy lives. Bulkley was never right in his mind and in and out of McLean's asylum. Edward, who graduated first in his class at Harvard, and Charles, who was my closest companion and friend, both died of tuberculosis before the age of 30. But the awfulest thing that happened was that Lydian and I lost our first and dearest child, little Waldo, to scarlet fever. This all but undid us, but we stood our ground and somehow survived. Happily, we had 3 more children who would greatly comfort us in later years. I never stopped writing, published several volumes of my poems and essays, and traveled to speak as far away as California. I continued to develop and express my ideas as long as I was able. I will read you now what is not my best, perhaps, but undoubtedly my most famous poem. Concord Hymn, sung at the completion of the Battle Monument, July 4th, 1837. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. The foe long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror silent sleeps, and time the ruined bridge has swept down the dark stream which seaward creeps. On this green bank, by this soft stream, we set today a votive stone, that memory may their deed redeem, when like our sires, our sons are gone. Spirit that made those heroes dare to die and leave their children free, bid time and nature gently spare the shaft we raise to them and thee. Well, it's not bad. And to conclude, I'll read one more. Terminus. Terminus. It is time to be old, to take in sail. The god of bounds, who sets to seize ashore, came to me in his fatal rounds and said, no more, no farther shoot thy broad ambitious branches and thy root. Fancy departs, no more invent. Contract thy firmament to compass of a tint. There's not enough for this and that. Make thy opinion which of two. Economize the failing river, not the less revere the giver. Leave the many and hold the few. Timely wise, accept the terms. Soften the fall with wary foot. A little while still plan and smile, and, fault of novel germs, mature the unfallen fruit. Curse, if thou wilt, thy sires, bad husbands of their fires, who, when they gave thee breath, failed to bequeath the needful sinew, stark as once the bearsark marrow to thy bones, but left a legacy of ebbing veins, inconstant heat, and nerveless reins. Amid the muses left thee deaf and dumb, amid the gladiators halt and numb. As the bird trims her to the gale, I trim myself to the storm of time. I man the rudder, reef the sail, obey the voice at eve, obeyed at prime. Lowly faithful, banish fear, right onward drive unharmed. The port, well worth the cruise, is near, and every wave is charmed.
Thank you so much. and Ms. Dickinson. We're very honored and respectful that you're here. Would you please honor us?
Thank you. I was told that some of you could hear me but not see me. And just consider that you were seeing me in spirit. I was being there in spirit, and now you're seeing me in body. So you got to see me twice. I picked out this one about pleasure of reading an antique book, and I seem to enjoy that. A precious moldering pleasure 'tis to meet an antique book in just the dress his century wore, a privilege, I think. His venerable hand to take, and warming in our own, a passage back or two to make, to times when he was young. His quaint opinions to inspect, his thought to ascertain, on themes concern our mutual mind, the literature of man. What interested scholars most, what competitions ran, when Plato was a certainty and Sophocles a man. When Sappho was a living girl and Beatrice wore